The Moonstone, Part 40. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins. Read by Joel Portinger. The Discovery of the Truth, Third Narrative, Chapter 9. The doctor's pretty housemaid stood waiting for me, with the street door open in her hand. Pouring brightly into the hall, the morning light fell full on the face of Mr. Candy's assistant when I turned and looked at him. It was impossible to dispute Bettridge's assertion that the appearance of Ezra Jennings, speaking from the popular point of view, was against him. His gypsy complexion, his fleshless cheeks, his gaunt facial bones, his dreamy eyes, his extraordinary parti-coloured hair, the puzzling contradiction between his face and figure, which made him look old and young both together, were all more or less calculated to produce an unfavourable impression of him on a stranger's mind. And yet, feeling this as I certainly did, it is not to be denied that Ezra Jennings made some inscrutable appeal to my sympathies, which I found it impossible to resist, while my knowledge of the world warned me to answer the question which he had put, by acknowledging that I did indeed find Mr. Candy sadly changed, and then proceed on my own way out of the house. My interest in Ezra Jennings held me rooted to the place, and gave him the opportunity of speaking to me in private about his employer, for which he had been evidently on the watch. "Are you walking my way, Mr. Jennings?" I said, observing that he held his hat in his hand. "I am going to call on my aunt, Mrs. Ablewhite." Ezra Jennings replied that he had a patient to see, and that he was walking my way. We left the house together. I observed that the pretty servant girl, who was all smiles and amiability when I wished her good morning on my way out, received a modest little message from Ezra Jennings, relating to the time at which he might be expected to return, with pursed-up lips and with eyes which ostentatiously looked anywhere rather than look in his face. The poor wretch was evidently no favourite in the house. Out of the house, I had Bettridge's word for it that he was unpopular everywhere. What a life! I thought to myself as we descended the doctor's doorsteps. Having already referred to Mr. Candy's illness on his side, Ezra Jennings now appeared determined to leave it to me to resume the subject. His silence said significantly, "It's your turn now." I too had my reasons for referring to the doctor's illness, and I readily accepted the responsibility of speaking first. "Judging by the change I see in him," I began, "Mr. Candy's illness must have been far more serious than I had supposed." "It is almost a miracle," said Ezra Jennings, "that he lived through it. Is his memory never any better than I have found it today? He has been trying to speak to me." "Of something which happened before he was taken ill?" asked the assistant, observing that I hesitated. "Yes." "His memory of events at that time past is hopelessly enfeebled," said Ezra Jennings. "It is almost to be deplored, poor fellow, that even the wreck of it remains, while he remembers dimly plans that he formed, things here and there that he had to say or do before his illness. He is perfectly incapable of recalling what the plans were, or what the thing was that he had to say or to do. He is painfully conscious of his own deficiency, and painfully anxious, as you must have seen, to hide it from observation. If he could only have recovered in a complete state of oblivion as to the past, he would have been a happier man. Perhaps we should all be happier," he added with a sad smile, "if we could but completely forget." "There are some events, surely, in all men's lives," I replied, "the memory of which they would be unwilling entirely to lose." "That is, I hope, to be said of most men, Mr. Blake. I am afraid it cannot be truly said of all. Have you any reason to suppose that the lost remembrance which Mr. Candy tried to recover, while you were speaking to him just now, was a remembrance which it was important to you that he should recall?" In saying those words, he had touched, of his own accord, on the very point upon which I was anxious to consult him. The interest I felt in this strange man had impelled me, in the first instance, to give him the opportunity of speaking to me, reserving what I might have to say on my side in relation to his employer until I was first satisfied that he was a person in whose delicacy and discretion I could trust. The little that he had said thus far had been sufficient to convince me that I was speaking to a gentleman. He had what I may venture to describe as the unsought self-possession, which is a sure sign of good breeding, not in England only, but everywhere else in the civilized world. Whatever the object which he had in view in putting the question that he had just addressed to me, I felt no doubt that I was justified, so far, in answering him without reserve. "I believe I have a strong interest," I said, "in tracing the lost remembrance which Mr. Candy was unable to recall. May I ask whether you can suggest to me any method by which I might assist his memory?" Ezra Jennings looked at me with a sudden flash of interest in his dreamy brown eyes. "Mr. Candy's memory is beyond the reach of assistance," he said. "I have tried to help it often enough since his recovery to be able to speak positively on that point." This disappointed me, and I owned it. "I confess you led me to hope for a less discouraging answer than that," I said. Ezra Jennings smiled. "It may not, perhaps, be a final answer, Mr. Blake. It may be possible to trace Mr. Candy's lost recollection without the necessity of appealing to Mr. Candy himself." "Indeed? Is it an indiscretion on my part to ask how?" "By no means. My only difficulty in answering your question is the difficulty of explaining myself. May I trust to your patience if I refer once more to Mr. Candy's illness, and if I speak of it this time without sparing you certain professional details?" "Pray go on. You have interested me already in hearing the details." My eagerness seemed to amuse, perhaps I might rather say, to please him. He smiled again. We had by this time left the last houses in the town behind us. Ezra Jennings stopped for a moment and picked some wildflowers from the hedge by the roadside. "How beautiful they are," he said simply, showing his little nosegay to me, "and how few people in England seem to admire them as they deserve." "You have not always been in England?" I said. "No, I was born and partly brought up in one of our colonies. My father was an Englishman, but my mother— We are straying away from our subject, Mr. Blake, and it is my fault. The truth is, I have associations with these modest little hedge-side flowers. It doesn't matter. We were speaking of Mr. Candy. To Mr. Candy let us return." Connecting the few words about himself which thus reluctantly escaped him with a melancholy view of life which led him to place the conditions of human happiness in complete oblivion of the past, I felt satisfied that the story which I had read in his face was, in two particulars at least, the story that it really told. He had suffered as few men suffer, and there was the mixture of some foreign race in his English blood. "You have heard, I dare say, of the original cause of Mr. Candy's illness," he resumed. "The night of Lady Verinder's dinner party was a night of heavy rain. My employer drove home through it in his gig and reached the house wetted to the skin. He found an urgent message from a patient waiting for him, and he most unfortunately went at once to visit the sick person without stopping to change his clothes. I was myself professionally detained that night by a case at some distance from Frizinghall. When I got back the next morning, I found Mr. Candy's groom waiting in great alarm to take me to his master's room. By that time the mischief was done. The illness had set in." "The illness has only been described to me in general terms as a fever," I said. "I can add nothing which will make the description more accurate," answered Ezra Jennings. "From first to last the fever assumed no specific form. I sent at once to two of Mr. Candy's medical friends in town, both physicians, to come and give me their opinion of the case. They agreed with me that it looked serious, but they both strongly dissented from the view I took of the treatment. We differed entirely in the conclusions which we drew from the patient's pulse. The two doctors, arguing from the rapidity of the beat, declared that a lowering treatment was the only treatment to be adopted. On my side, I admitted the rapidity of the pulse, but I also pointed to its alarming feebleness as indicating an exhausted condition of the system, and as showing a plain necessity for the administration of stimulants. The two doctors were for keeping him on gruel, lemonade, barley water, and so on. I was for giving him champagne or brandy, ammonia, and quinine. A serious difference of opinion, as you see. A difference between two physicians of established local repute and a stranger who was only an assistant in the house. For the first few days I had no choice but to give way to my elders and betters, the patient steadily sinking all the time. I made a second attempt to appeal to the plain, undeniably plain, evidence of the pulse. Its rapidity was unchecked, and its feebleness had increased. The two doctors took offence at my obstinacy. They said, "Mr. Jennings, either we manage this case, or you manage it. Which is it to be?" I said, "Gentlemen, give me 5 minutes to consider, and that plain question shall have a plain reply." When the time had expired, I was ready with my answer. I said, "You positively refuse to try the stimulant treatment?" They refused in so many words. "I mean to try it at once, gentlemen." "Try it, Mr. Jennings, and we withdraw from the case." I sent down to the cellar for a bottle of champagne, and I administered half a tumblerful of it to the patient with my own hand. The two physicians took up their hats in silence and left the house. "You had assumed a serious responsibility," I said. "In your place, I am afraid that I should have shrunk from it." "In my place, Mr. Blake, you would have remembered that Mr. Candy had taken you into his employment under circumstances which made you debtor for life." "In my place, Mr. Blake, you would have remembered that Mr. Candy had taken you into his employment under circumstances which made you his debtor for life. In my place, you would have seen him sinking hour by hour, and you would have risked anything rather than let the one man on earth who had befriended you die before your eyes. Don't suppose that I had no sense of the terrible position in which I had placed myself. There were moments when I felt all the misery of my friendlessness, all the peril of my dreadful responsibility. If I had been a happier man, if I had led a prosperous life, I believe I should have sunk under the task I had imposed on myself. But I had no happy time to look back at, no past peace of mind to force itself into contrast with my present anxiety and suspense. And I held firm to my resolution through it all. I took an interval in the middle of the day, when my patient's condition was at its best, for the repose I needed. For the rest of the 24 hours, as long as his life was in danger, I never left his bedside. Toward sunset, as usual in such cases, the delirium incidental to the fever came on. It lasted more or less through the night, and then intermitted at that time, in the early morning, from 2 o'clock to 5, when the vital energies of the healthiest of us are at their lowest. It is then that death gathers in his human harvest most abundantly. It was then that death and I fought our fight over the bed which should have the man who lay on it. I never hesitated in pursuing the treatment on which I had staked everything. When wine failed, I tried brandy. When the other stimulants lost their influence, I doubled the dose. After an interval of suspense, the like of which I hope to God I shall never feel again, there came a day when the rapidity of the pulse slightly but appreciably diminished, and, better still, there came also a change in the beat, an unmistakable change to steadiness and strength. Then I knew that I had saved him, and then, I own, I broke down. I laid the poor fellow's wasted hand back on the bed and burst out crying. An hysterical relief, Mr. Blake, nothing more. Physiology says, and says truly, that some men are born with female constitutions, and I am one of them. He made that bitterly professional apology for his tears, speaking quietly and unaffectedly, as he had spoken throughout. His tone and manner, from beginning to end, showed him to be especially, almost morbidly anxious not to set himself up as an object of interest to me. "You may well ask why I have wearied you with all these details," he went on. "It is the only way I can see, Mr. Blake, of properly introducing to you what I have to say next. Now you know exactly what my position was at the time of Mr. Candy's illness, you will the more readily understand the sore need I had of lightening the burden on my mind by giving it, at intervals, some sort of relief. I have had the presumption to occupy my leisure for some years past in writing a book addressed to the members of my profession, a book on the intricate and delicate subject of the brain and the nervous system. My work will probably never be finished, and it will certainly never be published. It has none the less been the friend of many lonely hours, and it helped me to while away the anxious time, the time of waiting, and nothing else, at Mr. Candy's bedside. I told you he was delirious, I think, and I mentioned the time at which his delirium came on. Yes. Well, I had reached a section of my book at that time which touched on the same question of delirium. I won't trouble you at any length with my theory on the subject. I will confine myself to telling you only what it is your present interest to know. It has often occurred to me in the course of my medical practice to doubt whether we can justifiably infer, in cases of delirium, that the loss of the faculty of speaking connectedly implies the necessity of the loss of the faculty of thinking connectedly as well. Poor Mr. Candy's illness gave me an opportunity of putting this doubt to the test. I understand the art of writing in shorthand, and I was able to take down the patient's wanderings exactly as they fell from his lips. Do you see, Mr. Blake, what I am coming to at last? I saw it clearly, and waited with breathless interest to hear more. At odds and ends of time, Ezra Jennings went on, I reproduced my shorthand notes in the ordinary form of writing, leaving large spaces between the broken phrases and even the single words as they had fallen disconnectedly from Mr. Candy's lips. I then treated the result thus obtained on something like the principle which one adopts in putting together a child's puzzle. It is all confusion to begin with, but it may be all brought into order and shape if you can only find the right way. Acting on this plan, I filled in the blank spaces on the paper with what words or phrases on either side of it suggested to me as the speaker's meaning, altering over and over again until my additions followed naturally on the spoken words which came before them and fitted naturally into the spoken words which came after them. The result was that I not only occupied in this way many vacant and anxious hours, but that I arrived at something which was, as it seemed to me, a confirmation of the theory that I held. In plainer words, after putting the broken sentences together, I found the superior faculty of thinking going on, more or less connectedly, in my patient's mind, while the inferior faculty of expression was in a state of almost complete incapacity and confusion. One word, I interposed greedily. Did my name occur in any of his wanderings? You shall hear, Mr. Blake. Among my written proofs of the assertion which I have just advanced, or I ought to say among the written experiments tending to put my assertion to the proof, there is one in which your name occurs. For nearly the whole of one night Mr. Candy's mind was occupied with something between himself and you. I have got the broken words as they dropped from his lips on one sheet of paper, and I have got the links of my own discovering which connect those words together on another sheet of paper. The product, as the arithmeticians would say, is an intelligible statement, first, of something actually done in the past, secondly, of something which Mr. Candy contemplated doing in the future, if his illness had not got in the way and stopped him. The question is whether this does, or does not, represent the lost recollection which he vainly attempted to find when you called on him this morning. Not a doubt of it, I answered. Let us go back directly and look at the papers. Quite impossible, Mr. Blake. Why? Put yourself in my position for a moment, said Ezra Jennings. Would you disclose to another person what had dropped unconsciously from the lips of your suffering patient and your helpless friend, without first knowing that there was a necessity to justify you in opening your lips? I felt that he was unanswerable here, but I tried to argue the question nevertheless. My conduct in such a delicate matter as you describe, I replied, would depend greatly on whether the disclosure was of a nature to compromise my friend or not. I have disposed of all necessity for considering that side of the question long since, said Ezra Jennings. Wherever my notes included anything which Mr. Candy might have wished to keep secret, those notes have been destroyed. My manuscript experiments at my friend's bedside include nothing now which he would have hesitated to communicate to others, if he had recovered the use of his memory. In your case, I have even reason to suppose that my notes contain something which he actually wished to say to you. And yet you hesitate? And yet I hesitate. Remember the circumstances under which I obtained the information which I possess. Harmless as it is, I cannot prevail upon myself to give it up to you, unless you first satisfy me that there is a reason for doing so. He was so miserably ill, Mr. Blake, and he was so helplessly dependent upon me. Is it too much to ask, if I request you only to hint to me what your interest is in the lost recollection, or what you believe that lost recollection to be?" To have answered him with a frankness which his language and his manner both claimed from me would have been to commit myself to openly acknowledging that I was suspected of the theft of the diamond. Strongly as Ezra Jennings had intensified the first impulsive interest which I felt in him, he had not overcome my unconquerable reluctance to disclose the degrading position in which I stood. I took refuge once more in the explanatory phrases which I had prepared myself to meet the curiosity of strangers. This time I had no reason to complain of a want of attention on the part of the person to whom I addressed myself. Ezra Jennings listened patiently, even anxiously, until I had done. "I am sorry to have raised your expectations, Mr. Blake, only to disappoint them," he said. "Throughout the whole period of Mr. Candy's illness from first to last, not one word about the diamond escaped his lips. The matter with which I heard him connect your name has, I can assure you, no discoverable relation whatever with the loss or the recovery of Miss Verinder's jewel." We arrived, as he said those words, at a place where the highway along which we had been walking branched off into two roads. One led to Mr. Ablewhite's house, the other to a moorland village some 2 or 3 miles off. Ezra Jennings stopped at the road which led to the village. "My way lies in this direction," he said. "I am really and truly sorry, Mr. Blake, that I can be of no use to you." His voice told me that he spoke sincerely. His soft brown eyes rested on me for a moment with a look of melancholy interest. He bowed and went, without another word, on his way to the village. For a moment or more I stood and watched him, walking farther and farther away from me, carrying farther and farther away with him what I now firmly believed to be the clue of which I was in search. He turned, after walking on a little way, and looked back. Seeing me still standing at the place where we had parted, he stopped, as if doubting whether I might not wish to speak to him again. There was no time for me to reason out my own situation, to remind myself that I was losing my opportunity at what might be the turning point in my life, and all to flatter nothing more important than my own self-esteem. There was only time to call him back first and to think afterward. I suspect I am one of the rashest of existing men. I called him back, and then I said to myself, "Now there is no help for it. I must tell him the truth." He retraced his steps directly. I advanced along the road to meet him. "Mr. Jennings," I said, "I have not treated you quite fairly. My interest in tracing Mr. Candy's lost recollection is not the interest of recovering the Moonstone. A serious personal matter is at the bottom of my visit to Yorkshire. I have but one excuse for not having dealt frankly with you in this matter. It is more painful to me than I can say to mention to anybody what my position really is." Ezra Jennings looked at me with the first appearance of embarrassment which I had seen in him yet. "I have no right, Mr. Blake, and no wish," he said, "to intrude myself into your private affairs. Allow me to ask your pardon on my side for having most innocently put you to a painful test." "You have a perfect right," I rejoined, "to fix the terms on which you feel justified in revealing what you heard at Mr. Candy's bedside. I understand and respect the delicacy which influences you in this matter. How can I expect to be taken into your confidence if I decline to admit you into mine? You ought to know, and you shall know, why I am interested in discovering what Mr. Candy wanted to say to me. If I turn out to be mistaken in my anticipations, and if you prove unable to help me when you are really aware of what I want, I shall trust to your honour to keep my secret, and something tells me that I shall not trust in vain." "Stop, Mr. Blake. I have a word to say, which must be said before you go any further." I looked at him in astonishment. The grip of some terrible emotion seemed to have seized him and shaken him to the soul. His gypsy complexion had altered to a livid greyish paleness. His eyes had suddenly become wild and glittering. His voice had dropped to a tone, low, stern, and resolute, which I now heard for the first time. The latent resources of the man for good or for evil, it was hard at that moment to say which, leapt up in him and showed themselves to me with the suddenness of a flash of light. "Before you place any confidence in me," he went on, "you ought to know, and you must know, under what circumstances I have been received into Mr. Candy's house. It won't take long. I don't profess, sir, to tell my story, as the phrase is, to any man. My story will die with me. All I ask is to be permitted to tell you what I have told Mr. Candy. If you are still in the mind, when you have heard that, to say what you have proposed to say, you will command my attention and to command my services. Shall we walk on?" The suppressed misery in his face silenced me. I answered his question by a sign. We walked on. After advancing a few hundred yards, Ezra Jennings stopped at a gap in the rough stone wall which shut off the moor from the road at this part of it. "Do you mind resting a little, Mr. Blake?" he asked. "I am not what I was, and some things shake me." Of course I agreed. He led the way through the gap to a patch of turf on the heathy ground, screened by bushes and dwarf trees on the side nearest to the road, and commanding in the opposite direction a grandly desolate view over the broad brown wilderness of the moor. The clouds had gathered within the last half-hour. The light was dull. The distance was dim. The lovely face of nature met us, soft and still and colourless, met us without a smile. We sat down in silence. Ezra Jennings laid his hat aside, and passed his hand wearily over his forehead, wearily through his startling white and black hair. He tossed his little nosegay of wild flowers away from him, as if the remembrances which it recalled were remembrances which hurt him now. "Mr. Blake," he said suddenly, "you are in bad company. The cloud of a horrible accusation has rested on me for years. I tell you the worst at once. I am a man whose life is a wreck, and whose character is gone." I attempted to speak. He stopped me. "No," he said. "Pardon me, not yet. Don't commit yourself to expressions of sympathy which you may afterward wish to recall. I have mentioned an accusation which has rested on me for years. There are circumstances in connection with it that tell against me. I cannot bring myself to acknowledge what the accusation is, and I am incapable, perfectly incapable, of proving my innocence. I can only assert my innocence. I assert it, sir, on my oath as a Christian. It is useless to appeal to my honour as a man." He paused again. I looked round at him. He never looked at me in return. His whole being seemed to be absorbed in the agony of recollecting, and in the effort to speak. "There is much that I might say," he went on, "about the merciless treatment of me by my own family, and the merciless enmity to which I have fallen a victim. But the harm is done. The wrong is beyond all remedy now. I decline to weary or distress you, sir, if I can help it. At the outset of my career in this country, the vile slander to which I have referred struck me down at once and forever. I resigned my aspirations in my profession. Obscurity was the only hope left for me. I parted with the woman I loved. How could I condemn her to share my disgrace? A medical assistant's place offered itself in a remote corner of England. I got the place. It promised me peace. It promised me obscurity, as I thought. I was wrong. Evil report, with time and chance to help it, travels patiently and travels far. The accusation from which I had fled followed me. I got warning of its approach. I was able to leave my situation voluntarily, with the testimonials that I had earned. They got me another situation, in another remote district. Time passed again, and again the slander that was death to my character found me out. On this occasion I had no warning. My employer said, "Mr. Jennings, I have no complaint to make against you, but you must set yourself right or leave me." I had one choice. I left him. It's useless to dwell on what I suffered after that. I'm only 40 years old now. Look at my face, and let it tell for me the story of some miserable years. It ended in my drifting to this place and meeting with Mr. Candy. He wanted an assistant. I referred him, on the question of capacity, to my last employer. The question of my character remained. I told him what I have told you, and more. I warned him that there were difficulties in the way, even if he believed me. Here, as elsewhere,
I said. "I scorn the guilty evasion of living under an assumed name. I am no safer at Frizzing Hall than at other places from the cloud that follows me, go where I may." He answered, "I don't do things by halves. I believe you, and I pity you. If you will risk what may happen, I will risk it too. God Almighty bless him. He has given me shelter. He has given me employment. He has given me rest of mind. And I have the certain conviction, I have had it for some months past, that nothing will happen now to make him regret it." "The slander has died out?" I said. "The slander is as active as ever, but when it follows me here, it will come too late." "You will have left the place?" "No, Mr. Blake, I shall be dead. For 10 years past I have suffered from an incurable internal complaint. I don't disguise from you that I should have let the agony of it kill me long since, but for one last interest in life, which makes my existence of some importance to me still. I want to provide for a person, very dear to me, whom I shall never see again. My own little patrimony is hardly sufficient to make her independent of the world. The hope, if I could only live long enough, of increasing it to a certain sum, has impelled me to resist the disease by such palliative means as I could devise. The one effectual palliative in my case is opium. To that all-potent and all-merciful drug I am indebted for a respite of many years from the sentence of death. But even the virtues of opium have their limit. The progress of the disease has gradually forced me from the use of opium to the abuse of it. I am feeling the penalty at last. My nervous system is shattered. My nights are nights of horror. The end is not far off now. Let it come. I have not lived and worked in vain. The little sum is nearly made up, and I have the means of completing it if my last reserves of life fail me sooner than I expect. I hardly know how I have wandered into telling you this. I don't think I am mean enough to appeal to your pity. Perhaps I fancy you may be all the readier to believe me, if you know what I have said to you. I have said with a certain knowledge in me that I am a dying man. There is no disguising, Mr. Blake, that you interest me. I have attempted to make my poor friend's loss of memory the means of bettering my acquaintance with you. I have speculated on the chance of your feeling a passing curiosity about what he wanted to say, and of my being able to satisfy it. Is there no excuse for my intruding myself on you? Perhaps there is some excuse. A man who has lived, as I have lived, his bitter moments when he ponders over human destiny. You have youth, health, riches, a place in the world, a prospect before you. You, and such as you, show me the sunny side of human life, and reconcile me with the world that I am leaving before I go. However this talk between us may end, I shall not forget that you have done me a kindness in doing that. It rests with you, sir, to say what you proposed saying, or to wish me good morning." I had but one answer to make to that appeal. Without a moment's hesitation I told him the truth as unreservedly as I have told it in these pages. He started to his feet, and looked at me with a breathless eagerness as I approached the leading incident of my story. "It is certain that I went into the room," I said. "It is certain that I took the diamond. I can only meet those two plain facts by declaring that, do what I might, I did it without my own knowledge. You may believe that I have spoken the truth." Ezra Jennings caught me excitedly by the arm. "Stop," he said. "You have suggested more to me than you suppose. Have you ever been accustomed to the use of opium?" "I never tasted it in my life." "Were your nerves out of order at this time last year? Were you unusually restless and irritable?" "Yes." "Did you sleep badly?" "Wretchedly. Many nights I never slept at all." "Was the birthday night an exception? Try and remember. Did you sleep well on that one occasion?" "I do remember. I slept soundly." He dropped my arm as suddenly as he had taken it, and looked at me with the air of a man whose mind was relieved of the last doubt that rested on it. "This is a marked day in your life and in mine," he said gravely. "I am absolutely certain, Mr. Blake, of one thing. I have got what Mr. Candy wanted to say to you this morning in the notes that I took at my patient's bedside. Wait, that is not all. I am firmly persuaded that I can prove you to have been unconscious of what you were about when you entered the room and took the diamond. Give me time to think, and time to question you. I believe the vindication of your innocence is in my hands." "Explain yourself, for God's sake. What do you mean?" In the excitement of our colloquy, we had walked on a few steps beyond the clump of dwarf trees which had hitherto screened us from view. Before Ezra Jennings could answer me, he was hailed from the high road by a man in great agitation, who had evidently been on the lookout for him. "I'm coming," he called back. "I'm coming as fast as I can." He turned to me. "There is an urgent case waiting for me at the village yonder. I ought to have been there half an hour since. I must attend to it at once. Give me 2 hours from this time, and call at Mr. Candy's again, and I will engage to be ready for you." "How am I to wait?" I exclaimed impatiently. "Can't you quiet my mind by a word of explanation before we part?" "This is far too serious a matter to be explained in a hurry, Mr. Blake. I am not wilfully trying your patience. I should only be adding to your suspense if I attempted to relieve it as things are now. At Frizzing Hall, sir, in 2 hours' time." The man on the high road hailed him again. He hurried away and left me. End of section 40. The Moonstone, Part 41. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Read by Joel Portinger. The Discovery of the Truth, Third Narrative, Chapter 10. How the interval of suspense to which I was now condemned might have affected other men in my position, I cannot pretend to say. The influence of the 2 hours' probation upon my temperament was simply this. I felt physically incapable of remaining still in any one place, and morally incapable of speaking to any one human being, until I had first heard all that Ezra Jennings had to say to me. In this frame of mind I not only abandoned my contemplated visit to Mrs. Ablewhite, I even shrank from encountering Gabriel Bettridge himself. Returning to Frizinghall, I left a note for Bettridge, telling him that I had been unexpectedly called away for a few hours, but that he might certainly expect me to return toward 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I requested him, in the interval, to order his dinner at the usual hour, and to amuse himself as he pleased. He had, as well I know, hosts of friends in Frizinghall, and he would be at no loss how to fill up his time until I returned to the hotel. This done, I made the best of my way out of the town again, and roamed the lonely moorland country which surrounds Frizinghall, until my watch told me that it was time, at last, to return to Mr. Candy's house. I found Ezra Jennings ready and waiting for me. He was sitting alone in a bare little room, which communicated by a glazed door with a surgery. Hideous coloured diagrams of the ravages of hideous diseases decorated the barren buff-coloured walls. A bookcase filled with dingy medical works and ornamented at the top with a skull in place of the customary bust. A large deal table copiously splashed with ink. Wooden chairs of the sort that are seen in kitchens and cottages. A threadbare drugget in the middle of the floor. A sink of water with a basin and waste-pipe roughly let into the wall, horribly suggestive of its connection with surgical operations, comprised the entire furniture of the room. The bees were humming among a few flowers placed in pots outside the window, the birds were singing in the garden, and the faint intermittent jingle of a tuneless piano in some neighbouring house forced itself now and again on the ear. In any other place these everyday sounds might have spoken pleasantly of the everyday world outside. Here they came in as intruders on a silence which nothing but human suffering had the privilege to disturb.
I looked at the mahogany instrument case, and at the huge roll of lint occupying places of their own on the bookshelves, and shuddered inwardly as I thought of the sounds, familiar and appropriate to the everyday use of Ezra Jennings' room. "I make no apology, Mr. Blake, for the place in which I am receiving you," he said. "It is the only room in the house at this hour of the day in which we can feel quite sure of being left undisturbed. Here are my papers ready for you, and here are 2 books to which we may have occasion to refer before we have done. Bring your chair to the table, and we shall be able to consult them together." I drew up to the table, and Ezra Jennings handed me his manuscript notes. They consisted of 2 large folio leaves of paper. One leaf contained writing which only covered the surface at intervals. The other presented writing in red ink and black ink, which completely filled the page from top to bottom. In the irritated state of my curiosity at that moment, I laid aside the second sheet of paper in despair. "Have some mercy on me," I said. "Tell me what I am to expect before I attempt to read this." "Willingly, Mr. Blake. Do you mind my asking you 1 or 2 more questions?" "Ask me anything you like." He looked down at me with a sad smile on his lips, and the kindly interest in his soft brown eyes. "You have already told me," he said, "that you have never, to your knowledge, tasted opium in your life." "To my knowledge?" I repeated. "You will understand directly why I speak with that reservation. Let us go on. You are not aware of ever having taken opium. At this time last year you were suffering from nervous irritation, and you slept wretchedly at night. On the night of the birthday, however, there was an exception to the rule. You slept soundly. Am I right so far?" "Quite right." "Can you assign any cause for your nervous suffering and your want of sleep?" "I can assign no cause. Old Bettridge made a guess at the cause, I remember, but that is hardly worth mentioning." "Pardon me, anything is worth mentioning in such a case as this. Bettridge attributed your sleeplessness to something. To what?" "To my leaving off smoking." "Had you been a habitual smoker?" "Yes." "Did you leave off the habit suddenly?" "Yes." "Bettridge was perfectly right, Mr. Blake. When smoking is a habit, a man must have no common constitution who can leave it off suddenly without some temporary damage to his nervous system. Your sleepless nights are accounted for, to my mind. My next question refers to Mr. Candy. Do you remember having entered into anything like a dispute with him, at the birthday dinner or afterward, on the subject of his profession?" The question instantly awakened one of my dormant remembrances in connection with the birthday festival. The foolish wrangle which took place on that occasion between Mr. Candy and myself will be found described at much greater length than it deserves in the 10th chapter of Bettridge's narrative. The details there presented of the dispute, so little had I thought of it afterward, entirely failed to recur to my memory. All that I could now recall, and all that I could tell Ezra Jennings, was that I had attacked the art of medicine at the dinner-table with sufficient rashness and sufficient pertinacity to put even Mr. Candy out of temper for the moment. I also remembered that Lady Verinder had interfered to stop the dispute, and that the little doctor and I had made it up again, as the children say, and had become as good friends as ever before we shook hands that night. "There is one thing more," said Ezra Jennings, "which it is very important that I should know. Had you any reason for feeling any special anxiety about the diamond at this time last year?" "I had the strongest reasons for feeling anxiety about the diamond. I knew it to be the object of a conspiracy, and I was warned to take measures for Miss Verinder's protection as the possessor of the stone." "Was the safety of the diamond the subject of conversation between you and any other person immediately before you retired to rest on the birthday night?" "It was the subject of a conversation between Lady Verinder and her daughter." "Which took place in your hearing?" "Yes." Ezra Jennings took up his notes from the table and placed them in my hands. "Mr. Blake," he said, "if you read those notes now by the light which my questions and your answers have thrown on them, you will make 2 astounding discoveries concerning yourself. You will find, first,
that you entered Miss Verinder's sitting-room and took the diamond in a state of trance produced by opium. Secondly, that the opium was given to you by Mr. Candy, without your own knowledge, as a practical refutation of the opinions which you had expressed to him at the birthday dinner. I sat with the papers in my hand, completely stupefied. "Try and forgive poor Mr. Candy," said the assistant, gently. "He has done dreadful mischief, I own, but he has done it innocently. If you will look at the notes, you will see that, but for his illness, he would have returned to Lady Verinder's the next morning after the party, and would have acknowledged the trick that he had played on you. Miss Verinder would have heard of it, and Miss Verinder would have questioned him, and the truth, which has lain hidden for a year, would have been discovered in a day." I began to regain my self-possession. "Mr. Candy is beyond the reach of my resentment," I said angrily, "but the trick that he played me is not the less an act of treachery for all that. I may forgive, but I shall not forget it." "Every medical man commits that act of treachery, Mr. Blake, in the course of his practice. The ignorant distrust of opium, in England, is by no means confined to the lower and less cultivated classes. Every doctor in large practice finds himself, every now and then, obliged to deceive his patients, as Mr. Candy deceived you. I don't defend the folly of playing a trick on you under the circumstances. I only plead with you for a more accurate and more merciful construction of motives." "How was it done?" I asked. "Who gave me the laudanum without my knowing it myself?" "I am not able to tell you. Nothing relating to that part of the matter dropped from Mr. Candy's lips all through his illness. Perhaps your own memory may point to the person to be suspected?" "No. It is useless, in that case, to pursue the inquiry. The laudanum was secretly given to you in some way. Let us leave it there, and go on to matters of more immediate importance. Read my notes if you can. Familiarize your mind with what has happened in the past. I have something very bold and very startling to propose to you which relates to the future." Those last words roused me. I looked at the papers, in the order in which Ezra Jennings had placed them in my hands. The paper which contained the smaller quantity of writing was the uppermost of the two. On this the disconnected words and fragments of sentences which had dropped from Mr. Candy in delirium appeared as follows. "Mr. Franklin Blake, and agreeable, down a peg, medicine, confesses, sleep at night, tell him, out of order, medicine, he tells me, and groping in the dark mean one and the same thing. All the company at the dinner-table, I say, groping after sleep, nothing but medicine. He says, leading the blind, know what it means. Witty, a night's rest in spite of his teeth. Want sleep. Lady Verinder's medicine chest. 25 minims. Without his knowing it. Tomorrow morning. Well, Mr. Blake, medicine today? Never. Without it. Out, Mr. Candy. Excellent. Without it. Down on him. Truth. Something besides. Excellent. Dose of laudanum. Sir. Bed. What? Medicine now. There were the first of the 2 sheets of paper come to an end. I handed it back to Ezra Jennings. "That is what you heard at his bedside," I said. "Literally and exactly what I heard," he answered, "except that the repetitions are not transferred here from my shorthand notes. He reiterated certain words and phrases 12 times over, 50 times over, just as he attached more or less importance to the idea which they represented. The repetitions, in this sense, were of some assistance to me in putting together those fragments. Don't suppose," he added, pointing to the second sheet of paper, "that I claim to have reproduced the expressions which Mr. Candy himself would have used if he had been capable of speaking connectedly. I only say that I have penetrated through the obstacle of the disconnected expression
to the thought which was underlying it connectedly all the time. Judge for yourself. I turned to the second sheet of paper, which I now knew to be the key to the first. Once more Mr. Candy's wanderings appeared copied in black ink, in intervals between the phrases filled up by Ezra Jennings in red ink. I reproduce the result here, in one plain form, the original language and the interpretation of it coming close enough together in the pages to be easily compared and verified. Mr. Franklin Blake is clever and agreeable, but he wants taken down a peg when he talks of medicine. He confesses that he has been suffering from want of sleep at night. I tell him that his nerves are out of order, and that he ought to take medicine. He tells me that taking medicine and groping in the dark mean one and the same thing. This before all the company at the dinner-table. I say to him, you are groping after sleep, and nothing but medicine can help you find it. He says to me, I have heard of the blind leaving the blind, and now I know what it means. Witty, but I can give him a night's rest in spite of his teeth. He really wants sleep, and Lady Verinder's medicine chest is at my disposal. Give him 25 minims of laudanum tonight, without his knowing it, and then call tomorrow morning. Well, Mr. Blake, will you try a little medicine to-day? You will never sleep without it. There you are out, Mr. Candy. I had an excellent night's rest without it. Then come down on him with the truth. You have had something besides an excellent night's rest. You had a dose of laudanum, sir, before you went to bed. What do you say to the art of medicine now? Admiration of the ingenuity which had woven this smooth and finished texture out of the ravelled skein was naturally the first impression that I felt on handing the manuscript back to Ezra Jennings. He modestly interrupted the first few words, in which my sense of surprise expressed itself, by asking me if the conclusion which he had drawn from his notes was also the conclusion at which my own mind had arrived. "Do you believe, as I believe," he said, "that you were acting under the influence of the laudanum in doing all that you did on the night of Miss Verinder's birthday in Lady Verinder's house?" "I am too ignorant of the influence of laudanum to have an opinion of my own," I answered. "I can only follow your opinion, and feel convinced that you are right." "Very well. The next question is this. You are convinced, and I am convinced. How are we to carry our conviction to the minds of other people?" I pointed to the two manuscripts lying on the table between us. Ezra Jennings shook his head. "Useless, Mr. Blake, quite useless as they stand now, for 3 unanswerable reasons. In the first place, these notes have been taken under circumstances entirely out of the experience of the mass of mankind, against them to begin with. In the second place, these notes represent a medical and metaphysical theory, against them once more. In the third place, those notes are of my taking. There is nothing but my assertion to the contrary, to guarantee that they are not fabrications. Remember what I told you on the moor, and ask yourself what my assertion is worth. No, my notes have but one value, looking to the verdict of the world outside. Your innocence is to be vindicated, and they show how it can be done. We must put our conviction to the proof, and you are the man to prove it." "How?" I asked. He leaned eagerly nearer to me across the table that divided us. "Are you willing to try a bold experiment?" "I will do anything to clear myself of the suspicion that rests on me now." "Will you submit to some personal inconvenience for a time?" "To any inconvenience, no matter what it may be." "Will you be guided implicitly by my advice? It may expose you to the ridicule of fools. It may subject you to the remonstrances of friends whose opinions you are bound to respect." "Tell me what to do," I broke out impatiently, "and come what may, I'll do it." "You shall do this, Mr. Blake," he answered. "You shall steal the diamond unconsciously for the second time, in the presence of witnesses whose testimony is beyond dispute." I started to my feet. I tried to speak. I could only look at him. "I believe it can be done," he went on, "and it shall be done, if you will only help me. Try to compose yourself. Sit down and hear what I have to say to you. You have resumed the habit of smoking. I have seen that for myself. How long have you resumed it?" "For nearly a year." "Do you smoke more or less than you did?" "More." "Will you give up the habit again? Suddenly, mind,
as you gave it up before?" I began dimly to see his drift. "I will give it up from this moment," I answered. "If the same consequences follow which followed last June," said Ezra Jennings, "if you suffer once more, as you suffered then, from sleepless nights, we shall have gained our first step. We shall have put you back again into something simulating your nervous condition on the birthday night. If we can next revive, or nearly revive, the domestic circumstances which surrounded you, and if we can occupy your mind again with the various questions concerning the diamond which formerly agitated it, we shall have replaced you, as nearly as possible, in the same position, physically and morally, in which the opium found you last year. In that case we may fairly hope that a repetition of the dose will lead, in a greater or lesser degree, to a repetition of the result. There is my proposal, expressed in a few hasty words. You shall now see what reasons I have to justify me in making it." He turned to one of the books at his side, and opened it at a place marked by a small slip of paper. "Don't suppose that I am going to weary you with a lecture on physiology," he said. "I think myself bound to prove, in justice to both of us, that I am not asking you to try this experiment in deference to any theory of my own devising. Admitted principles and recognized authorities justify me in the view that I take. Give me 5 minutes of your attention, and I will undertake to show you that science sanctions my proposal, fanciful as it may seem. Here, in the first place, is the physiological principle on which I am acting, stated by no less a person than Dr. Carpenter. Read it for yourself." He handed me the slip of paper which had marked the place in the book. It contained a few lines of writing as follows: "There seems much ground for the belief that every sensory impression which has once been recognized by the perceptive consciousness is registered, so to speak, in the brain, and may be reproduced at some subsequent time, although there may be no consciousness of its existence in the mind during the whole intermediate period." "Is that plain so far?" asked Ezra Jennings. "Perfectly plain." He pushed the open book across the table to me and pointed to a passage marked by pencil lines. "Now," he said, "read that account of a case which has, as I believe, a direct bearing on your own position, and on the experiment which I am tempting you to try. Observe, Mr. Blake, before you begin, that I am now referring you to one of the greatest of English physiologists. The book in your hand is Dr. Eliotson's Human Physiology, and the case which the doctor cites rests on the well-known authority of Mr. Combe." The passage pointed out to me was expressed in these terms: "Dr. Abel informed me," says Mr. Combe, "of an Irish porter to a warehouse who forgot when sober what he had done when drunk, but being drunk again recollected the transactions of his former state of intoxication. On one occasion, being drunk, he had lost a parcel of some value, and in his sober moments could give no account of it. Next time he was intoxicated, he recollected that he had left a parcel at a certain house, and there being no address on it, it had remained there safely, and was got on his calling for it." "Plain again?" asked Ezra Jennings. "As plain as need be." He put back the slip of paper in its place, and closed the book. "Are you satisfied that I have not spoken without good authority to support me?" he asked. "If not, I've only to go to those bookshelves, and you have only to read the passages which I can point out to you." "I am quite satisfied," I said, "without reading a word more." "In that case, we may return to your own personal interest in this matter. I am bound to tell you that there is something to be said against the experiment, as well as for it. If we could, this year, exactly reproduce, in your case, the conditions as they existed last year, it is physiologically certain that we should arrive at exactly the same result. But this, there is no denying it, is simply impossible. We can only hope to approximate to the conditions, and if we don't succeed in getting you nearly enough back to where you were, this venture of ours will fail. If we do succeed, and I myself am hopeful of success, you may at least so far repeat your proceedings on the birthday night as to satisfy any reasonable person that you are guiltless, morally speaking, of the theft of the diamond. I believe, Mr. Blake, I have now stated the question on both sides of it as fairly as I can, within the limits that I have imposed on myself. If there is anything that I have not made clear to you, tell me what it is, and if I can enlighten you, I will." "All that you have explained to me," I said, "I understand perfectly, but I own I am puzzled on one point which you have not made clear to me." "What is the point?" "I don't understand the effect of the laudanum on me. I don't understand my walking downstairs and along corridors, and my opening and shutting the drawers of a cabinet, and my going back again to my own room. All these are active proceedings. I thought the influence of opium was first to stupefy you, and then to send you to sleep." "The common error about opium, Mr. Blake. I am at this moment exerting my intelligence, such as it is, in your service, under the influence of a dose of laudanum, some 10 times larger than the dose Mr. Kennedy administered to you. But don't trust to my authority, even on a question which comes within my own personal experience. I anticipated the objection you have just made, and I have again provided myself with independent testimony, which will carry its due weight with it in your own mind, and in the minds of your friends." He handed me the second of the 2 books, which he laid by him on the table. "There," he said, "are the far-famed Confessions of an English Opium-Eater. Take the book away with you, and read it. At the passage which I have marked, you will find that when De Quincey had committed what he calls a debauch of opium, he either went to the gallery at the opera to enjoy the music, or he wandered about the London markets on Saturday night, and interested himself in observing all the little shifts and bargainings of the poor in providing their Sunday dinners. So much for the capacity of a man to occupy himself actively, and to move about from place to place under the influence of opium." "I am answered so far," I said, "but I am not answered yet as to the effect produced by the opium on myself." "I will try to answer you in few words," said Ezra Jennings. "The action of opium is comprised, in the majority of cases, in 2 influences, a stimulating influence first, and a sedative influence afterward. Under the stimulating influence, the latest and most vivid impressions left on your mind, namely, the impressions relating to the diamond, would be likely, in your morbidly sensitive nervous condition, to become intensified in your brain, and would subordinate to themselves your judgment and your will, exactly as an ordinary dream subordinates itself to your judgment and your will. Little by little, under this action, any apprehensions about the safety of the diamond, which you might have felt during the day, would be liable to develop themselves from the state of doubt to the state of certainty, would impel you into practical action to preserve the jewel, would direct your steps, with that motive in view, into the room which you entered, and would guide your hand to the drawers of the cabinet, until you had found the drawer which held the stone. In the spiritualized intoxication of opium, you would do all that. Later, as the sedative action began to gain on the stimulant action, you would slowly become inert and stupefied. Later still, you would fall into a deep sleep. When the morning came, and the effect of the opium had all been slept off, you would wake as absolutely ignorant of what you had done in the night as if you had been living at the Antipodes. Have I made it tolerably clear to you so far?" "You have made it so clear," I said, "that I want you to go farther. You have shown me how I entered the room, and how I came to take the diamond, but Miss Verinder saw me leave the room again, with the jewel in my hand. Can you trace my proceedings from that moment? Can you guess what I did next?" "That is the very point I was coming to," he rejoined. "It is a question with me whether the experiment which I propose as a means of vindicating your innocence may not also be made a means of recovering the lost diamond as well. When you left Miss Verinder's sitting-room with the jewel in your hand, you went back in all probability to your own room." "Yes, and what then?" "It is possible, Mr. Blake, I dare not say more, that your idea of preserving the diamond led, by a natural sequence, to the idea of hiding the diamond, and that the place in which you hid it was somewhere in your bedroom. In that event, the case of the Irish porter may be your case. You may remember, under the influence of the second dose of opium, the place in which you hid the diamond under the influence of the first." It was my turn now to enlighten Ezra Jennings. I stopped him before he could say any more. "You are speculating," I said, "on a result which cannot possibly take place. The diamond is, at this moment, in London." He started and looked at me in great surprise. "In London?" he repeated. "How did it get to London from Lady Verinder's house?" "Nobody knows." "You removed it with your own hand from Miss Verinder's room. How was it taken out of your keeping?" "I have no idea how it was taken out of my keeping." "Did you see it when you woke in the morning?" "No." "Has Miss Verinder recovered possession of it?" "No." "Mr. Blake, there seems to be something here which wants clearing up. May I ask you how you know the diamond is at this moment in London?" I had put precisely the same question to Mr. Bruff when I made my first inquiries about the Moonstone on my return to England. In answering Ezra Jennings, I accordingly repeated what I had myself heard from the lawyer's own lips, and what is already familiar to the readers of these pages. He showed plainly that he was not satisfied with my reply. "With all deference to you," he said, "and with all deference to your legal adviser, I maintain the opinion which I expressed just now. It rests, I am well aware, on a mere assumption. Pardon me for reminding you that your opinion also rests on a mere assumption as well." The view he took of the matter was entirely new to me. I waited anxiously to hear how he would defend it. "I assume," pursued Ezra Jennings, "that the influence of the opium, after impelling you to possess yourself of the diamond, with the purpose of securing its safety, might also impel you, acting under the same influence and the same motive, to hide it somewhere in your own room. You assume that the Hindu conspirators could by no possibility commit a mistake. The Indians went to Mr. Luca's house after the diamond, and, therefore, in Mr. Luca's possession the diamond must be. Have you any evidence to prove that the Moonstone was taken to London at all? You can't even guess how, or by whom it was removed from Lady Verinder's house. Have you any evidence that the jewel was pledged to Mr. Luca? He declares that he never heard of the Moonstone, and his banker's receipt acknowledges nothing but the deposit of a valuable of great price. The Indians assume that Mr. Luca is lying, and you assume again that the Indians are right. All I say in defence of my view is, that it is possible. What more, Mr. Blake, either logically or legally, can be said for yours?" It was put strongly, but there was no denying that it was put truly as well. "I confess you stagger me," I replied. "Do you object to my writing to Mr. Bruff and telling him what you have said?" "On the contrary, I shall be glad if you will write to Mr. Bruff. If we consult his experience, we may see the matter under a new light. For the present, let us return to our experiment with the opium. We have decided that you leave off the habit of smoking from this moment." "From this moment." "That is the first step. The next step is to reproduce, as nearly as we can, the domestic circumstances which surrounded you last year." "How is this to be done? Lady Verinder was dead. Rachel and I, so long as the suspicion of theft rested on me, were parted irrevocably. Godfrey Ablewhite was away, travelling on the Continent. It was simply impossible to reassemble the people who had inhabited the house when I had slept in it last." The statement of this objection did not appear to embarrass Ezra Jennings. He attached very little importance, he said, to reassembling the same people, seeing that it would be vain to expect them to reassume the various positions which they had occupied toward me in the past time. On the other hand, he considered it essential to the success of the experiment that I should see the same objects about me which had surrounded me when I was in the house last year. "Above all things," he said, "you must sleep in the room in which you slept on the birthday night, and it must be furnished in the same way. The stairs, the corridors, and Miss Verinder's sitting-room must also be restored to what they were when you last saw them. It is absolutely necessary, Mr. Blake, to replace every article of furniture in that part of the house which may now be put away. The sacrifice of your cigars will be useless unless we can get Miss Verinder's permission to do that." "Who is to apply to her for permission?" I asked. "Is it not possible for you to apply?" "Quite out of the question. After what has passed between us on the subject of the lost diamond, I can neither see her nor write to her, as things are now." Ezra Jennings paused and considered for a moment. "May I ask you a delicate question?" he said. I signed him to go on. "Am I right, Mr. Blake, in fancying, from one or two things which have dropped from you, that you felt no common interest in Miss Verinder in former times?" "Quite right." "Was the feeling returned?" "It was." "Do you think Miss Verinder would be likely to feel a strong interest in the attempt to prove your innocence?" "I am certain of it." "In that case I will write to Miss Verinder, if you will give me leave." "Telling her of the proposal that you have made to me?" "Telling her of everything that has passed between us today." It is needless to say that I eagerly accepted the service which he had offered to me. "I shall have time to write by today's post," he said, looking at his watch. "Don't forget to lock up your cigars when you get back to the hotel. I will call tomorrow morning and hear how you have passed the night." I rose to take leave of him, and attempted to express the grateful sense of his kindness which I really felt. He pressed my hand gently. "Remember what I told you on the moor," he answered. "If I can do you this little service, Mr. Blake, I shall feel it like a last gleam of sunshine falling on the evening of a long and cloudy day." We parted. It was then the 15th of June. The events of the next 10 days, every one of them more or less directly connected with the experiment of which I was the passive object, are all placed on record, exactly as they happened, in the journal habitually kept by Mr. Candy's assistant. In the pages of Ezra Jennings nothing is concealed, and nothing is forgotten. Let Ezra Jennings tell how the venture with the opium was tried, and how it ended. End of Part 41.
Moonstone, Part 42. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Read by Graham Redman. The Discovery of the Truth. Fourth narrative, extracted from the Journal of Ezra Jennings. 1849, June the 15th. With some interruption from patience, and some interruption from pain, I finished my letter to Miss Verinder in time for today's post. I failed to make it as short a letter as I could have wished, but I think I have made it plain. It leaves her entirely mistress of her own decision. If she consents to assist the experiment, she consents of her own free will, and not as a favour to Mr. Franklin Blake or to me. June the 16th. Rose late after a dreadful night, the vengeance of yesterday's opium pursuing me through a series of frightful dreams. At one time I was whirling through empty space with the phantoms of the dead, friends and enemies together. At another, the one beloved face which I shall never see again rose at my bedside, hideously phosphorescent in the black darkness, and glared and grinned at me. A slight return of the old pain at the usual time in the early morning was welcome as a change. It dispelled the visions, and it was bearable because it did that. My bad night made it late in the morning before I could get to Mr. Franklin Blake. I found him stretched on the sofa, breakfasting on brandy and soda water and a dry biscuit. "I am beginning as well as you could possibly wish," he said. "A miserable restless night and a total failure of appetite this morning. Exactly what happened last year when I gave up my cigars. The sooner I am ready for my second dose of laudanum, the better I shall be pleased." "You shall have it on the earliest possible day," I answered. "In the meantime we must be as careful of your health as we can. If we allow you to become exhausted, We shall fail in that way. You must get an appetite for your dinner. In other words, you must get a ride or a walk this morning in the fresh air." "I will ride, if they can find me a horse here. By the by, I wrote to Mr. Brough yesterday. Have you written to Miss Verinder?" "Yes, by last night's post." "Very good. We shall have some news worth hearing to tell each other tomorrow. Don't go yet. I have a word to say to you. You appeared to think yesterday that our experiment with the opium was not likely to be viewed very favourably by some of my friends. You were quite right. I call old Gabriel Betteridge one of my friends, and you will be amused to hear that he protested strongly when I saw him yesterday. You have done a wonderful number of foolish things in the course of your life, Mr. Franklin, but this tops them all. There is Betteridge's opinion. You will make allowance for his prejudices, I am sure, if you and he happen to meet." I left Mr. Blake to go my rounds among my patients, feeling the better and the happier even for the short interview that I had had with him. What is the secret of the attraction that there is for me in this man? Does it only mean that I feel the contrast between the frankly kind manner in which he has allowed me to become acquainted with him, and the merciless dislike and distrust with which I am met by other people? Or is there really something in him which answers to the yearning that I have for a little human sympathy, the yearning which has survived the solitude and persecution of many years, which seems to grow keener and keener as the time comes nearer and nearer when I shall endure and feel no more? How useless to ask these questions! Mr. Blake has given me a new interest in life. Let that be enough, without seeking to know what the new interest is. June the 17th. Before breakfast this morning Mr. Candy informed me that he was going away for a fortnight on a visit to a friend in the south of England. He gave me as many special directions, poor fellow, about the patients, as if he still had the large practice which he possessed before he was taken ill. The practice is worth little enough now. Other doctors have superseded him, and nobody who can help it will employ me. It is perhaps fortunate that he is to be away just at this time. He would have been mortified if I had not informed him of the experiment which I am going to try with Mr. Blake, and I hardly know what undesirable results might not have happened if I had taken him into my confidence. Better as it is, unquestionably better as it is. The post brought me Miss Verinder's answer after Mr. Candy had left the house. A charming letter. It gives me the highest opinion of her. There is no attempt to conceal the interest that she feels in our proceedings. She tells me, in the prettiest manner, that my letter has satisfied her of Mr. Blake's innocence without the slightest need, so far as she is concerned, of putting my assertion to the proof. She even upbraids herself, most undeservedly, poor thing, for not having divined at the time what the true solution of the mystery might really be. The motive underlying all this proceeds evidently from something more than a generous eagerness to make atonement for a wrong which she has innocently inflicted on another person. It is plain that she has loved him throughout the estrangement between them. In more than one place the rapture of discovering that he has deserved to be loved breaks its way innocently through the stoutest formalities of pen and ink, and even defies the stronger restraints still of writing to a stranger. Is it possible, I ask myself in reading this delightful letter, that I, of all men in the world, am chosen to be the means of bringing these two young people together again? My own happiness has been trampled underfoot. My own love has been torn from me. Shall I live to see a happiness of others which is of my making, a love renewed which is of my bringing back? O merciful death, let me see it before your arms enfold me, before your voice whispers to me, rest at last. There are 2 requests contained in the letter. One of them prevents me from showing it to Mr. Franklin Blake. I am authorized to tell him that Miss Verinder willingly consents to place her house at our disposal, and that said, I am desired to add no more. So far it is easy to comply with her wishes, but the second request embarrasses me seriously. Not content with having written to Mr. Betteridge, instructing him to carry out whatever directions I may have to give, Miss Verinder asks leave to assist me by personally superintending the restoration of her own sitting-room. She only waits a word of reply from me to make the journey to Yorkshire, and to be present as one of the witnesses on the night when the opium is tried for the second time. Here again there is a motive under the surface, and here again I fancy that I can find it out. What she has forbidden me to tell Mr. Franklin Blake, she is, as I interpret it, eager to tell him with her own lips, before he is put to the test which is to vindicate his character in the eyes of other people. I understand and admire this generous anxiety to acquit him, without waiting until his innocence may or may not be proved. It is the atonement that she is longing to make, poor girl, after having innocently and inevitably wronged him. But the thing cannot be done. I have no sort of doubt that the agitation which a meeting between them would produce on both sides, reviving dormant feelings, appealing to old memories, awakening new hopes, would, in their effect on the mind of Mr. Blake, be almost certainly fatal to the success of our experiment. It is hard enough, as things are, to reproduce in him the conditions as they existed, or nearly as they existed, last year. With new interests and new emotions to agitate him, the attempt would be simply useless. And yet, knowing this, I cannot find it in my heart to disappoint her. I must try if I can discover some new arrangement, before post-time, which will allow me to say yes to Miss Verinder without damage to the service which I have bound myself to render to Mr. Franklin Blake. 2 o'clock. I have just returned from my round of medical visits, having begun, of course, by calling at the hotel. Mr. Blake's report of the night is the same as before. He has had some intervals of broken sleep, and no more. But he feels it less to-day, having slept after yesterday's dinner. This after-dinner sleep is the result, no doubt, of the ride which I advised him to take. I fear I shall have to curtail his restorative exercise in the fresh air. He must not be too well, he must not be too ill. It is a case, as a sailor would say, of very fine steering. He has not heard yet from Mr. Brough. I found him eager to know if I had received any answer from Miss Verinder. I told him exactly what I was permitted to tell, and no more. It was quite needless to invent excuses for not showing him the letter. He told me bitterly enough, poor fellow, that he understood the delicacy which disinclined me to produce it. "She consents, of course, as a matter of common courtesy and common justice," he said, "but she keeps her own opinion of me, and waits to see the result." I was sorely tempted to hint that he was now wronging her as she had wronged him. On reflection, I shrank from forestalling her in the double luxury of surprising and forgiving him. My visit was a very short one. After the experience of the other night, I have been compelled once more to give up my dose of opium. As a necessary result, the agony of the disease that is in me has got the upper hand again. I felt the attack coming on, and left abruptly, so as not to alarm or distress him. It only lasted a quarter of an hour this time, and it left me strength enough to go on with my work. 5 o'clock. I have written my reply to Miss Verinder. The arrangement I have proposed reconciles the interests on both sides, if she will only consent to it. After first stating the objections that there are to a meeting between Mr. Blake and herself before the experiment is tried, I have suggested that she should so time her journey as to arrive at the house privately on the evening when we make the attempt. Travelling by the afternoon train from London, she would delay her arrival until 9 o'clock. At that hour I have undertaken to see Mr. Blake safely into his bedchamber, and so to leave Miss Verinder free to occupy her own rooms until the time comes for administering the laudanum. When that has been done, there can be no objection to her watching the result with the rest of us. On the next morning she shall show Mr. Blake, if she likes, her correspondence with me, and shall satisfy him in that way that he was acquitted in her estimation before the question of his innocence was put to the proof. In that sense I have written to her. This is all that I can do today. Tomorrow I must see Mr. Betteridge, and give the necessary directions for reopening the house. June the 18th. Late again in calling on Mr. Franklin Blake. More of that horrible pain in the early morning, followed this time by complete prostration for some hours. I foresee, in spite of the penalties which it exacts from me, that I shall have to return to the opium for the 100th time. If I had only myself to think of, I should prefer the sharp pains to the frightful dreams. But the physical suffering exhausts me. If I let myself sink, it may end in my becoming useless to Mr. Blake at the time when he wants me most. It was nearly 1 o'clock before I could get to the hotel today. The visit, even in my shattered condition, proved to be a most amusing one, thanks entirely to the presence on the scene of Gabriel Betteridge. I found him in the room when I went in. He withdrew to the window and looked out, while I put my first customary question to my patient. Mr. Blake had slept badly again, and he felt the loss of rest this morning more than he had felt it yet. I asked next if he had heard from Mr. Brough. A letter had reached him that morning. Mr. Brough expressed the strongest disapproval of the course which his friend and client was taking under my advice. It was mischievous, for it excited hopes that might never be realized. It was quite unintelligible to his mind, except that it looked like a piece of trickery akin to the trickery of mesmerism, clairvoyance, and the like. It unsettled Miss Verinder's house, and it would end in unsettling Miss Verinder herself. He had put the case, without mentioning names, to an eminent physician, and the eminent physician had smiled, had shaken his head, and had said nothing. On these grounds Mr. Brough entered his protest, and left it there. My next inquiry related to the subject of the diamond. Had the lawyer produced any evidence to prove that the jewel was in London? No, the lawyer had simply declined to discuss the question. He was himself satisfied that the Moonstone had been pledged to Mr. Luca. His eminent absent friend, Mr. Murthwaite, whose consummate knowledge of the Indian character no one could deny, was satisfied also. Under these circumstances, and with the many demands already made on him, he must decline entering into any disputes on the subject of evidence. Time would show, and Mr. Brough was willing to wait for time. It was quite plain, even if Mr. Blake had not made it plainer still by reporting the substance of the letter instead of reading what was actually written, that distrust of me was at the bottom of all this. Having myself foreseen that result, I was neither mortified nor surprised. I asked Mr. Blake if his friend's protest had shaken him. He answered emphatically that it had not produced the slightest effect on his mind. I was free after that to dismiss Mr. Brough from consideration, and I did dismiss him accordingly. A pause in the talk between us followed, and Gabriel Betteredge came out from his retirement at the window. "Can you favour me with your attention, sir?" he inquired, addressing himself to me. "I am quite at your service," I answered. Betteredge took a chair and seated himself at the table. He produced a huge, old-fashioned leather pocket-book, with a pencil of dimensions to match. Having put on his spectacles, he opened the pocket-book at a blank page, and addressed himself to me once more. "I have lived," said Betteredge, looking at me sternly, "nigh on 50 years in the service of my late lady. I was page-boy before that, in the service of the old lord, her father. I am now somewhere between 70 and 80 years of age, never mind exactly where. I am reckoned to have got as pretty a knowledge and experience of the world as most men. And what does it all end in? It ends, Mr. Ezra Jennings, in a conjuring trick being performed on Mr. Franklin Blake by a doctor's assistant with a bottle of laudanum, and by the living jingo I'm appointed in my old age to be conjurer's boy." Mr. Blake burst out laughing. I attempted to speak. Betteredge held up his hand in token that he had not done yet. "Not a word, Mr. Jennings," he said. "It don't want a word, sir, from you. I have got my principles, thank God. If an order comes to me, which is own brother to an order come from Bedlam, it don't matter. So long as I get it from my master or mistress, as the case may be, I obey it. I may have my own opinion, which is also, you will please to remember, the opinion of Mr. Brough, the great Mr. Brough," said Betteredge, raising his voice and shaking his head at me solemnly. "It don't matter. I withdraw my opinion for all that. My young lady says, 'Do it,' and I say, 'Miss, it shall be done.' Here I am with my book and my pencil, the latter not pointed so well as I could wish, but when Christians take leave of their senses, who is to expect that pencils will keep their points? Give me your orders, Mr. Jennings. I'll have them in writing, sir. I'm determined not to be behind 'em or before 'em by so much as a hair's breadth. I'm a blind agent. That's what I am, a blind agent," repeated Betteredge, with infinite relish of his own description of himself. "I am very sorry," I began, "that you and I don't agree." "Don't bring me into it," interposed Betteredge. "This is not a matter of agreement, it's a matter of obedience. Issue your directions, sir, issue your directions." Mr. Blake made me a sign to take him at his word. I issued my directions as plainly and as gravely as I could. "I wish certain parts of the house to be reopened," I said, "and to be furnished exactly as they were furnished at this time last year." Betteredge gave his imperfectly pointed pencil a preliminary lick with his tongue. "Name the parts, Mr. Jennings," he said loftily. "First, the inner hall leading to the chief staircase." "First, the inner hall," Betteredge wrote. "Impossible to furnish that, sir, as it was furnished last year, to begin with." "Why?" "Because there was a stuffed buzzard, Mr. Jennings, in the hall last year. When the family left, the buzzard was put away with the other things. When the buzzard was put away, he burst." "We will accept the buzzard, then." Betteredge took a note of the exception. "The inner hall to be furnished again, as furnished last year, a burst buzzard alone excepted. Please to go on, Mr. Jennings." "The carpet to be laid down on the stairs as before." The carpet to be laid down on the stairs as before. Sorry to disappoint you, sir, but that can't be done either." "Why not?" "Because the man who laid that carpet down is dead, Mr. Jennings, and the like of him for reconciling together a carpet and a corner is not to be found in all England, look where you may." "Very well, we must try the next best man in England." Betteridge took another note, and I went on issuing my directions. Miss Verinder's sitting-room to be restored exactly to what it was last year, also the corridor leading from the sitting-room to the first landing, also the second corridor leading from the second landing to the best bedrooms, also the bedroom occupied last June by Mr. Franklin Blake. Betteridge's blunt pencil followed me conscientiously word by word. "Go on, sir," he said with sardonic gravity. "There's a deal of writing left in the point of this pencil yet." I told him that I had no more directions to give. "Sir," said Betteridge, "in that case I have a point or two to put on my own behalf." He opened the pocket-book at a new page and gave the inexhaustible pencil another preliminary lick. "I wish to know," he began, "whether I may or may not wash my hands—" "You may decidedly," said Mr. Blake. "I'll ring for the waiter." "Of certain responsibilities," pursued Betteridge, impenetrably declining to see anybody in the room but himself and me. "As to Miss Verinder's sitting-room to begin with. When we took up the carpet last year, Mr. Jennings, we found a surprising quantity of pins. Am I responsible for putting back the pins?" "Certainly not." Betteridge made a note of that concession on the spot. "As to the first corridor next," he resumed. "When we moved the ornaments in that part, we moved a statue of a fat naked child, profanely described in the catalogue of the house as Cupid, god of love. He had 2 wings last year, in the fleshy part of his shoulders. My eye being off him, for the moment he lost one of them. Am I responsible for Cupid's wing?" I made another concession, and Betteridge made another note. "As to the second corridor," he went on, "there having been nothing in it last year but the doors of the rooms, to every one of which I can swear, if necessary, my mind is easy, I admit, respecting that part of the house only. But as to Mr. Franklin's bedroom, if that is to be put back to what it was before, I want to know who is responsible for keeping it in a perpetual state of litter, no matter how often it may be set right. His trousers here, his towels there, and his French novels everywhere. I say, who is responsible for untidying the tidiness of Mr. Franklin's room, him or me?" Mr. Blake declared that he would assume the whole responsibility with the greatest pleasure. Betteridge obstinately declined to listen to any solution of the difficulty without first referring it to my sanction and approval. I accepted Mr. Blake's proposal, and Betteridge made a last entry in the pocket-book to that effect. "Look in when you like, Mr. Jennings, beginning from to-morrow," he said, getting on his legs. "You will find me at work, with the necessary persons to assist me. I respectfully beg to thank you, sir, for overlooking the case of the stuffed buzzard and the other case of the Cupid's wing, as also for permitting me to wash my hands of all responsibility in respect of the pins on the carpet and the litter in Mr. Franklin's room. Speaking as a servant, I am deeply indebted to you. Speaking as a man, I consider you to be a person whose head is full of maggots, and I take up my testimony against your experiment as a delusion and a snare. Don't be afraid on that account of my feelings as a man getting in the way of my duty as a servant. You shall be obeyed. The maggots notwithstanding, sir, you shall be obeyed. if it ends in your setting the house on fire, damme if I send for the engines unless you ring the bell and order them first." With that farewell assurance he made me a bow and walked out of the room. "Do you think we can depend on him?" I asked. "Implicitly," answered Mr. Blake. "When we go to the house we shall find nothing neglected and nothing forgotten." June the 19th. Another protest against our contemplated proceedings, from a lady this time. The morning's post brought me 2 letters, one from Miss Verinder, consenting in the kindest manner to the arrangement that I have proposed, the other from the lady under whose care she is living, one Mrs. Merridew. Mrs. Merridew presents her compliments, and does not pretend to understand the subject on which I have been corresponding with Miss Verinder in its scientific bearings. Viewed in its social bearings, however, she feels free to pronounce an opinion. I am probably, Mrs. Merridew thinks, not aware that Miss Verinder is barely 19 years of age. To allow a young lady, at her time of life, to be present, without a chaperone, in a house full of men among whom a medical experiment is being carried on, is an outrage on propriety which Mrs. Merridew cannot possibly permit. If the matter is allowed to proceed, she will feel it to be her duty, at a serious sacrifice of her own personal convenience, to accompany Miss Verinder to Yorkshire. Under these circumstances she ventures to request that I will kindly reconsider the subject, seeing that Miss Verinder declines to be guided by any opinion but mine. Her presence cannot possibly be necessary, and a word from me to that effect would relieve both Mrs. Merridew and myself of a very unpleasant responsibility. Translated from polite commonplace into plain English, the meaning of this is, as I take it, that Mrs. Merridew stands in mortal fear of the opinion of the world. She has unfortunately appealed to the very last man in existence who has any reason to regard that opinion with respect. I won't disappoint Miss Verinder, and I won't delay a reconciliation between 2 young people who love each other and who have been parted too long already. Translated from plain English into polite commonplace, this means that Mr. Jennings presents his compliments to Mrs. Merridew, and regrets that he cannot feel justified in interfering any farther in the matter. Mr. Blake's report of himself this morning was the same as before. We determined not to disturb Betteridge by overlooking him at the house to-day. Tomorrow will be time enough for our first visit of inspection. End of Part 42.